My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 18 years, I dedicated my life to caring for the elderly at Pine Valley Nursing Home in rural Pennsylvania. I thought I was making a difference, bringing comfort to those in their final years. I had no idea I was part of something so much darker. It was a crisp October morning in 2019 when everything I believed about my workplace began to unravel. The autumn leaves were painting the Pennsylvania countryside in brilliant oranges and reds, and I was walking through the familiar corridors of Pine Valley, carrying my morning medication cart. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of breakfast from the kitchen had become as familiar to me as my own home. I had started working at Pine Valley fresh out of nursing school in 2001. Back then, I was 22, full of hope and determination to make a difference in people's lives. The facility seemed like a dream job, a beautiful Victorian mansion converted into a nursing home, surrounded by rolling hills and mature oak trees. The pay was surprisingly good for a rural facility, and the benefits were exceptional. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the medical director, had personally interviewed me, speaking passionately about their commitment to innovative elderly care. "We're not just maintaining lives here, Sarah," he had said, his steel-grey eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. "We're enhancing the quality of life for our residents through cutting-edge medical approaches." I was impressed. Dr. Blackwood was in his 50s then, distinguished-looking with silver hair and an air of authority that commanded respect. He had graduated from Johns Hopkins and had worked at several prestigious medical institutions before coming to Pine Valley. The other staff members spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and fear. Over the years, I had grown close to many residents. There was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a former librarian who still quoted Shakespeare despite her advancing dementia. Mr. Frank Kowalski, a World War II veteran who told the most incredible stories about his time in the Pacific Theater. And Mrs. Rose Chen, a gentle woman who had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s and still made the most beautiful origami cranes with her arthritic fingers. But that October morning, something felt different. I had noticed small changes over the past few months, changes that individually seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern that made me uneasy. Residents who had been stable for months suddenly experiencing rapid cognitive decline, new medications appearing on charts without clear explanations, and most disturbing of all, the increasing frequency of what Dr. Blackwood called research consultations. I was checking on Mrs. Hartwell when I first noticed the injection site. She was sleeping peacefully, her grey hair spread across the pillow like silver silk. As I adjusted her blanket, I saw a small bandage on her upper arm, fresh, maybe a day old. I checked her chart. No record of any injection or blood draw. "Mrs. Hartwell," I whispered, gently touching her shoulder. "How are you feeling today?" She opened her eyes slowly, looking confused. This wasn't unusual. She often had moments of disorientation, but something in her expression was different. There was a fear there that I hadn't seen before. "The man in the white coat," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "He came in the night. He said it wouldn't hurt," but she trailed off, her eyes becoming distant again. I felt a chill run down my spine. Night rounds were my responsibility, and I hadn't authorized any procedures. I made a mental note to check with the night shift supervisor, Janet Morrison. Janet had been at Pine Valley almost as long as I had, and she was meticulous about documentation. The rest of my morning rounds revealed more inconsistencies. Mr. Kowalski seemed unusually lethargic, and when I checked his vitals, his blood pressure was lower than normal. Mrs. Chen was agitated, something completely out of character for her. She kept asking about the tests in broken English, but when I asked her to elaborate, she just shook her head and turned away. During my lunch break, I decided to review some recent charts in the medical records room. Pine Valley still used a combination of paper and digital records, and I had access to most patient files as the head day nurse. What I found made my stomach turn. Over the past 6 months, there had been a significant increase in what were labeled as vitamin B12 injections and routine blood draws. But the frequency was unusual. Some residents were receiving these treatments 3 times a week. I had been a nurse long enough to know that B12 injections were typically given monthly at most, and the blood draw schedule seemed excessive for routine monitoring. I pulled Mrs. Hartwell's file and cross-referenced it with the pharmacy records. The B12 listed on her chart didn't match any of the standard formulations we typically used. The lot numbers were different, and when I looked up the manufacturer, I couldn't find any information about the company online. My hands were shaking as I continued to dig deeper. The pattern was consistent across dozens of residents, all receiving these mysterious injections, all showing subtle but concerning changes in their behavior and health status. And all of these procedures were being ordered directly by Dr. Blackwood, bypassing the usual nursing protocols. I was so absorbed in the files that I didn't hear footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across my desk. "Finding everything you need, Sarah?" I looked up to see Dr. Blackwood standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was wearing his usual white coat, perfectly pressed, with a stethoscope draped around his neck like a symbol of authority. "Oh, Dr. Blackwood," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just reviewing some medication schedules. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything important." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking seemed unnaturally loud in the small space. "You've always been very thorough, Sarah. It's one of the qualities I've always admired about you." He moved closer to my desk, his eyes scanning the open files. "But sometimes thoroughness can lead to unnecessary concerns." There was something in his tone that made me deeply uncomfortable. In 18 years of working together, Dr. Blackwood had never spoken to me in quite this way, friendly on the surface, but with an underlying current of warning. "I'm just trying to understand some of the new treatment protocols," I said, closing the files and standing up. "Some of the residents have been asking questions, and I want to make sure I can provide accurate information." "Of course," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Perhaps we should schedule a meeting to discuss any questions you might have. I'd be happy to clarify our enhanced care procedures." Enhanced care procedures. That was a new term. In all my years at Pine Valley, we had always just called it medical care. "That would be helpful," I replied, gathering the files. "Should I put these back in their proper places?" "Allow me," he said, extending his hand. "I need to review them anyway for tomorrow's rounds." I hesitated for a moment, then handed over the files. As he took them, his fingers brushed mine, and I noticed they were cold despite the warm temperature in the room. "Sarah," he said as I moved toward the door, "I hope you understand how important discretion is in our line of work. Our residents trust us to provide the best possible care, and sometimes that means utilizing treatment methods that might seem unconventional to those not familiar with the latest medical research." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was definitely a warning in his words now, thinly veiled, but unmistakable. That evening, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I lived alone in a small apartment about 10 minutes from Pine Valley, and usually I enjoyed the quiet after a long day of work. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive. I kept thinking about Mrs. Hartwell's frightened expression, about the mysterious injections, about Dr. Blackwood's cold fingers and colder smile. I decided to call Janet Morrison. She would be starting her night shift soon, and maybe she could provide some clarity about what was happening during the overnight hours. "Janet, it's Sarah," I said when she answered her phone. "I hope I'm not bothering you before your shift." "Not at all, honey," Janet replied in her warm southern accent. She had moved to Pennsylvania from Georgia 15 years ago, but had never lost her distinctive drawl. "What's on your mind?" "I wanted to ask you about some of the overnight procedures. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any doctors or medical staff coming in during your shift that I might not be aware of?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Janet spoke again, her voice was quieter, more cautious. "Sarah, can I ask why you're asking? I've noticed some inconsistencies in the medical records. and some of the residents seem to be receiving treatments that I'm not familiar with. I'm just trying to understand what's happening." Another pause. Then Janet sighed deeply. "Honey, I've been wanting to talk to someone about this for months, but I wasn't sure who I could trust. Yes, there have been unusual activities during the night shift. Dr. Blackwood comes in regularly, usually around 2 a.m., sometimes with other people I don't recognize. They go directly to certain residents' rooms, and they've made it very clear that I'm not to interfere or ask questions." My heart was pounding. What kind of other people? Medical personnel, I think, but not from our regular staff. They wear scrubs, but no name tags, and they bring their own equipment. Dr. Blackwood introduced one of them as Dr. Martinez from a research facility, but when I tried to make conversation, she just ignored me. "Janet, this doesn't sound right. Have you documented any of this?" I tried to, but Dr. Blackwood pulled me aside after the first few times and explained that they were conducting a special research study approved by the state health department. He said it was confidential and that any documentation would be handled by his team directly. He also mentioned that discussing the research with unauthorized personnel could result in termination and legal action. I felt sick. Janet was a single mother with 2 teenage daughters. She couldn't afford to lose her job, and Dr. Blackwood clearly knew that. "Which residents are they focusing on?" I asked. "It seems to rotate, but I've noticed they spend a lot of time with Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Kowalski, Mrs. Chen, and about a dozen others. Always the ones who don't have regular family visitors." That detail hit me like a physical blow. Of course, they would target the most vulnerable residents, those without advocates, without family members who might ask uncomfortable questions. "Janet, I think we need to do something about this." "Sarah, I've been thinking the same thing, but I'm scared. Dr. Blackwood has a lot of influence in this community. He sits on the hospital board, he's friends with the mayor, and he's donated a lot of money to local charities. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what proof do we have?" She was right, and that made the situation even more terrifying. Dr. Blackwood wasn't just the medical director of a nursing home, he was a pillar of the community. Any accusations against him would need to be backed up with solid evidence. "We need to start documenting everything," I said. "Carefully, quietly, but thoroughly. Times, dates, which residents are involved, what procedures are being performed. And we need to find out more about this research study he mentioned." "Are you sure about this, Sarah? If we're wrong or if we get caught?" "Janet, I've been a nurse for 18 years. I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen anything like this. Whatever is happening here, it's not standard medical care, and it's not in the best interests of our residents. We took an oath to do no harm, and right now, I think we're failing that oath by staying silent." We agreed to meet the next day during the shift change to compare notes and plan our next steps. After I hung up, I sat in my small living room, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. The weight of what we were considering felt enormous. We were essentially preparing to investigate our own workplace, to challenge someone with significant power and influence, and to potentially expose ourselves to serious professional and legal consequences. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Hartwell's frightened face, and I knew we had no choice. The next morning I arrived at Pine Valley earlier than usual. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just a few cars belonging to the night shift staff and Dr. Blackwood's black Mercedes sedan. I had never noticed before how out of place that expensive car looked in our modest employee parking area. I used my key card to enter through the staff entrance and made my way quietly through the corridors. The building had a different feeling in the early morning hours. More institutional, less homey. The usual sounds of daily activity were absent, replaced by the hum of medical equipment and the occasional murmur of voices from the nurses' station. I decided to check on some of the residents Janet had mentioned. Mrs. Hartwell was awake, sitting up in bed and staring out her window at the morning sky. She looked frail and tired, more so than usual. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," I said softly. "How are you feeling today?" She turned to look at me, and for a moment her eyes were completely clear and focused. "Sarah," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I need to tell you something important. I need to tell you while I still can." I moved closer to her bed, my heart racing. "What is it, Mrs. Hartwell?" "The man in the white coat, the one who comes at night. He's not trying to help us. He's doing something to us, something that makes us forget, makes us confused. But sometimes in the morning, I remember pieces." She gripped my hand with both of hers, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Last night, he brought a woman with him. She had dark hair and spoke with an accent. They gave me an injection, but it wasn't like the others. This one made me feel strange, like I was floating outside my body, and I heard them talking." "What did they say?" "The woman said something about cognitive enhancement trials and baseline measurements. The doctor, our doctor, he said they were making good progress, but needed to increase the dosage for the next phase. Sarah, I don't think they're trying to make us better. I think they're using us for something else." Before I could respond, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes widened with fear, and she quickly lay back down, closing her eyes and pretending to sleep. I busied myself checking her chart, trying to look like I was just doing routine morning rounds. Dr. Blackwood appeared in the doorway, dressed in his usual white coat, but looking somewhat disheveled, as if he had been working all night. "Sarah, you're here early today," he observed, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. "I wanted to get a head start on the morning medications," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Mrs. Hartwell seems to be resting comfortably." He stepped into the room and moved to the other side of the bed, looking down at the apparently sleeping woman. For a moment, his expression was unguarded, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that made my blood run cold. "Yes, she's been responding very well to our enhanced treatment protocol," he said. "Her cognitive function has shown remarkable plasticity." Plasticity, another clinical term that sounded ominous in this context. "That's wonderful," I managed to say. "Her family will be so pleased to hear about her progress." "Actually, Mrs. Hartwell doesn't have any family," Dr. Blackwood said, his eyes meeting mine. "No children, no siblings, no close friends. It's quite sad, really. So many of our residents are completely alone in the world." The way he said it made it clear that this wasn't a coincidence. He was telling me that he had specifically chosen residents who had no one to advocate for them, no one to ask questions or demand answers. "Well, she has us," I said. "We're like family to her." "Indeed we are," he replied, but his smile was cold. "And like family, we want what's best for her, even if she doesn't always understand what that means." I left Mrs. Hartwell's room feeling more disturbed than ever. Dr. Blackwood's words had been carefully chosen, but the message was clear. He was in control. He had chosen his victims carefully, and he expected my compliance. I spent the rest of the morning conducting my usual rounds, but I was also observing everything with new eyes. I noticed things I had previously overlooked or dismissed, the way certain residents seemed unusually docile or confused after their treatments, the fact that the medical supply closet was always locked, even though it had never been locked in my early years at Pine Valley, the presence of equipment I didn't recognize in some of the rooms. During my lunch break, I met Janet in the parking lot. She looked as tired and worried as I felt. "I did some research last night," she said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "I tried to find information about this research study Dr. Blackwood mentioned, but I couldn't find anything. No records with the state health department, no published studies, nothing." "That's what I was afraid of," I replied. "Janet, I think we're dealing with something illegal. I think Dr. Blackwood is conducting unauthorized medical experiments on our residents." The words hung in the air between us, making the situation real in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. We had finally named what we suspected, and now we had to decide what to do about it. "We need evidence," Janet said. "Real evidence that we can take to the authorities. But how do we get it without putting ourselves or the residents at risk?" I had been thinking about this all morning. "I have an idea, but it's risky. Tonight, during your shift, I want to come back to the facility. I'll hide in one of the empty rooms and try to document what happens during these nighttime visits." "Sarah, that's incredibly dangerous. If Dr. Blackwood catches you, if we don't do something, these experiments are going to continue. And who knows what the long-term effects might be on the residents." We've already seen cognitive decline, behavioral changes, and physical symptoms. What if it gets worse? Janet was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential consequences of inaction. Okay, she said finally, but we do this carefully. I'll text you when Dr. Blackwood arrives, and you'll need to be ready to hide or leave quickly if necessary. And Sarah, we need to have a backup plan in case something goes wrong. We spent the rest of our break working out the details. I would enter the building through a side entrance that Janet would unlock for me. There was an empty room on the second floor that had a good view of the hallway and was close enough to the residents' rooms that I might be able to hear conversations. Janet would keep watch and warn me if anyone was coming. The plan was far from perfect, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. As I drove home that evening, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. I was about to risk everything, my job, my career, possibly even my safety, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to protect the residents who had trusted us with their care. I spent the evening preparing. I charged my phone, made sure the camera function was working properly, and wrote down everything I had observed over the past few days. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record of what we had discovered. At 11:30 p.m., I drove back to Pine Valley. The building looked different at night, more imposing, more sinister. Most of the windows were dark, with only a few lights visible in the nurses' station and some of the resident rooms. Dr. Blackwood's Mercedes was in the parking lot, along with two other cars I didn't recognize. Janet met me at the side entrance, her face pale with anxiety. "He's already here?" she whispered. "He arrived about an hour ago with two other people. They went straight to the second floor." My heart was pounding as we made our way through the darkened corridors. The familiar building felt like a maze in the dim emergency lighting, and every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. The empty room Janet had chosen was perfect for our purposes. It had been a resident room until recently, when the occupant had passed away. The bed and most of the furniture had been removed, but there was still a chair by the window and enough space for me to hide if necessary. "I'll be at the nurses' station," Janet whispered. "If I see anyone coming this way, I'll text you immediately. Be careful, Sarah." I settled into the chair by the window, positioning myself so I could see down the hallway while remaining hidden in the shadows. The building was eerily quiet, with only the occasional sound of medical equipment or the soft footsteps of Janet making her rounds. At 1:47 a.m., I heard voices in the hallway. I carefully peered out and saw Dr. Blackwood approaching with two other people, a woman with dark hair wearing scrubs and a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. They were talking in low voices, but I could catch fragments of their conversation. "Baseline cognitive function established," the woman was saying. "Increase the dosage for phase 2. Dr. Blackwood replied. "Potential side effects are within acceptable parameters," the man added. They stopped outside Mrs. Chen's room, and Dr. Blackwood used a key card to unlock the door. I had never seen him use a key card for resident rooms before. We typically just knocked and entered, since the residents couldn't lock their doors from the inside. I carefully moved closer to the doorway of my hiding spot, trying to hear more of their conversation. My phone was ready to record, but I was afraid the sound might give me away. Through the partially open door of Mrs. Chen's room, I could see them setting up some kind of equipment. The woman was preparing a syringe, while the man was connecting what looked like monitoring devices. Dr. Blackwood was speaking to Mrs. Chen in a calm, reassuring voice. "This is just a routine treatment, Mrs. Chen. It will help you sleep better and improve your memory. You won't feel any discomfort." But I could see Mrs. Chen's face, and she looked terrified. She was trying to speak, but her words were slurred and difficult to understand. It was clear that she had already been given something to make her compliant. The woman administered the injection while the man monitored her vital signs on a portable device. They worked with the efficiency of a well-practiced team, documenting everything on tablets and taking photographs of Mrs. Chen's reactions. "Cognitive response appears normal," the woman reported. "Heart rate elevated, but within expected range. No immediate adverse reactions." "Excellent," Dr. Blackwood said. We'll monitor her overnight and check her cognitive function in the morning. If the results are consistent with our previous subjects, we can move to the next phase of the trial. Trial. The word confirmed my worst fears. These weren't treatments. They were experiments, and the residents were unwilling test subjects. They finished their work in Mrs. Chen's room and moved on to Mr. Kowalski's room. I managed to take several photos with my phone, though the lighting was poor and I wasn't sure how clear they would be. More importantly, I was able to record several minutes of their conversation, including their discussion of dosages, side effects, and future plans. As they worked on Mr. Kowalski, I heard more disturbing details. They were testing some kind of cognitive enhancement drug, but it was clearly experimental and potentially dangerous. The side effects within acceptable parameters they had mentioned included memory loss, confusion, and in some cases, permanent neurological damage. Subject 23 showed significant improvement in memory recall, the woman reported. But Subject 19 experienced complete retrograde amnesia. We may need to adjust the formulation. The amnesia could actually be beneficial for our purposes, Dr. Blackwood replied. If the subjects don't remember the treatments, they're less likely to resist or report them. I felt sick. They were deliberately causing memory loss to prevent the residents from reporting what was being done to them. It was a perfect crime. The victims couldn't remember being victimized. They spent about an hour in total, visiting 4 different residents. Each time, the procedure was the same: sedation, injection, monitoring, and documentation. They treated the elderly residents like laboratory animals, showing no concern for their dignity, comfort, or consent. As they prepared to leave, I heard Dr. Blackwood giving instructions to his colleagues. We'll continue with the current protocol for another 2 weeks, then evaluate the results. If the cognitive enhancement effects are stable, we can begin recruiting new subjects. I've identified several candidates from the waiting list, people with no family connections and limited financial resources. What about the nursing staff? The woman asked. Are you concerned about their observations? I've been monitoring the situation carefully, Dr. Blackwood replied. Most of the staff are focused on their routine duties and don't ask questions. There are a couple who have shown curiosity, but I'm confident I can manage them. My blood ran cold. He was talking about Janet and me. He knew we were suspicious, and he was planning to manage us. I needed to get out of there immediately. I waited until I heard them leave the building, then carefully made my way back to the side entrance where Janet was waiting for me. Her face was white with fear. Did you get anything? She whispered. More than enough, I replied, showing her my phone. Janet, we need to go to the police immediately. This is much worse than we thought. We left the building together, and I followed Janet to her apartment. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing the recordings and photos I had taken, and Janet shared additional observations from her months of watching the nighttime activities. The evidence was damning. We had recorded conversations about unauthorized medical experiments, documented the administration of unknown substances to non-consenting elderly residents, and captured evidence of a systematic program of abuse disguised as medical care. But we also knew that Dr. Blackwood was a powerful and respected member of the community. Taking him down would require more than just our testimony and some grainy photos. We needed to be strategic about how we presented our evidence and to whom. We should contact the state health department first, Janet suggested. They have the authority to investigate nursing homes and can shut down the facility if necessary. And the FBI, I added. If this involves experimental drugs and human subjects research, it's probably a federal crime. We also decided to contact a local investigative journalist who had a reputation for exposing corruption and abuse. Media attention would make it harder for Dr. Blackwood to cover up his activities or retaliate against us. As the sun began to rise, we finalized our plan. Janet would call in sick for her next shift, giving us time to contact the authorities without arousing suspicion. I would go to work as usual, trying to act normal, while we waited for the investigation to begin. But as I drove home to get ready for my regular shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Blackwood already knew what we had discovered. His comment about managing curious staff members kept echoing in my mind, and I wondered what he might do to protect his secret research program. I was about to find out that my fears were completely justified. When I arrived at Pine Valley for my morning shift, everything seemed normal on the surface. The parking lot had the usual number of cars, the staff was going about their regular duties, and the residents were having breakfast in the dining room. But I noticed that Dr. Blackwood's office door was closed, and there were voices coming from inside. More voices than usual. I tried to focus on my normal routine, checking on residents and administering morning medications, but I was hyper-aware of everything around me, looking for signs that our nighttime investigation had been discovered. Mrs. Chen seemed more confused than usual, which was heartbreaking given what I now knew about the experiments being performed on her. When I checked her chart, I saw that Dr. Blackwood had added a note about adjusting her medication regimen due to increased agitation. It was a perfect cover story for any behavioral changes caused by his illegal experiments. Mr. Kowalski was sleeping more than usual, and when I tried to wake him for his medication, he seemed disoriented and couldn't remember my name. This was particularly disturbing because he had always been one of our most alert and cognitively intact residents. As I was updating his chart, I heard my name being called over the intercom. "Sarah Mitchell, please report to Dr. Blackwood's office immediately." My heart started racing. This was it. He knew what we had done, and now I was going to face the consequences. I considered running, just leaving the building and driving straight to the police station. But I knew that would only make things worse, and it might put Janet and the residents at even greater risk. I walked slowly down the hallway toward Dr. Blackwood's office, trying to prepare myself for whatever was about to happen. The door was slightly open, and I could hear multiple voices inside. I knocked and waited for permission to enter. "Come in, Sarah," Dr. Blackwood's voice called out. I stepped into the office and immediately realized that this was much more serious than I had anticipated. Dr. Blackwood was sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. There were 3 other people in the room. 2 men in dark suits who looked like law enforcement or security personnel, and a woman in a business suit who was holding a tablet and taking notes. "Sarah, please have a seat," Dr. Blackwood said, gesturing to a chair in front of his desk. His tone was calm and professional, but there was something predatory in his eyes. "These gentlemen are from the pharmaceutical company that's been funding our research program," he continued. "And this is Dr. Patricia Vance, our research coordinator. We need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention." I sat down, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the fear that was coursing through my veins. The 2 men were watching me intently, and I had the distinct feeling that they weren't really from a pharmaceutical company. "Sarah," Dr. Vance began, "we understand that you've been asking questions about our enhanced care protocols. We appreciate your dedication to our residents, but we're concerned that you may have misunderstood the nature of our research program." "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, trying to buy time while I figured out how to handle this situation. "Last night, our security system detected unauthorized access to the building," one of the men said. His voice was flat and emotionless, like someone accustomed to delivering threats. "We have video footage of someone entering through a side entrance and moving through the building during the overnight hours." My mouth went dry. They had security cameras that I hadn't known about, and they had recorded my investigation. But I noticed that they hadn't mentioned Janet by name, which meant they might not know about her involvement yet. "We also found this in one of the empty rooms," Dr. Blackwood said, holding up a small device that looked like a listening device or camera. "It appears someone was attempting to conduct surveillance on our medical procedures. I had never seen that device before, which meant they were either lying or they had planted it to frame me. Either way, it was clear that they were building a case to discredit anything I might say about their illegal activities." "Sarah," Dr. Vance continued. We're prepared to offer you a very generous severance package and excellent references for future employment. All we ask in return is your discretion about our research program and your agreement not to discuss any proprietary medical information with outside parties. It was a bribe, pure and simple. They were offering to pay me to keep quiet about what I had discovered. The implication was clear. If I didn't accept their offer, the consequences would be much more severe. What if I'm not interested in leaving Pine Valley? I asked. I've been here for 18 years, and I care about these residents. The two men exchanged glances, and Dr. Blackwood's expression hardened. Sarah, I think you're misunderstanding the situation, he said. This isn't really a negotiation. We have evidence of your unauthorized access to the building, your violation of patient privacy, and your theft of confidential medical information. We could have you arrested right now, but we'd prefer to handle this quietly, Dr. Vance added. For everyone's sake, I realized that I was trapped. They had manufactured evidence against me, and they clearly had the resources and connections to make serious legal trouble for me. But more importantly, they were threatening the residents by continuing their illegal experiments. I need time to think about this, I said. Of course, Dr. Blackwood replied. Take the rest of the day off. We'll need your answer by tomorrow morning. As I left his office, I felt like I was walking through a nightmare. Everything I had worked for, everything I believed about my profession and my workplace, had been revealed as a lie. But I also knew that Janet and I had evidence of their crimes, and we still had a chance to expose them if we acted quickly. I drove straight to Janet's apartment, my hands shaking as I called her from the parking lot. They know, I said as soon as she answered. They have security footage, and they're trying to frame me. We need to go to the police right now. Janet met me at her door, already dressed and ready to go. She had spent the morning organizing our evidence and researching the best way to contact the authorities. I've already called the State Health Department and the FBI, she said. They're sending investigators this afternoon, and I contacted that journalist. She's meeting us at the police station in an hour. We drove to the local police station together, carrying printed copies of all our evidence and the recordings from my phone. The desk sergeant initially seemed skeptical. After all, Dr. Blackwood was a respected member of the community, and we were just two nurses making serious accusations. But when the FBI agents arrived and reviewed our evidence, their attitude changed completely. The recordings of Dr. Blackwood discussing unauthorized medical experiments and the photos of the nighttime procedures were exactly the kind of evidence they needed to launch a full investigation. Within hours, Pine Valley Nursing Home was swarming with federal agents, state health inspectors, and local police. I watched from the parking lot as they executed search warrants, seizing computers, medical records, and boxes of evidence. Dr. Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, his usual composure finally cracking as reporters shouted questions at him. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the horror that had been taking place under my nose for years. Dr. Blackwood hadn't been working alone. He was part of a network of researchers conducting illegal human experiments at nursing homes across 3 states. The pharmaceutical company funding the research was a front for a larger organization that had been testing experimental cognitive enhancement drugs on vulnerable populations. The residents of Pine Valley had been subjected to dozens of different experimental compounds, many of which had never been tested on humans before. The enhanced care protocols Dr. Blackwood had spoken about so proudly were actually systematic violations of every medical ethics standard that existed. Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Kowalski, Mrs. Chen, and 23 other residents had been given experimental drugs that altered their brain chemistry, sometimes permanently. Some of the compounds were designed to enhance memory and cognitive function, but others were intended to suppress memory formation, essentially creating chemical amnesia to prevent the subjects from remembering their abuse. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators found Dr. Blackwood's private research files. He had been meticulously documenting the effects of each experiment, treating the residents like laboratory specimens. His notes referred to them by number rather than name, and he had detailed records of their psychological and physical responses to various compounds. Subject 15 shows promising cognitive enhancement but exhibits increased agitation, one entry read. Recommend combining with sedative compound to improve compliance. Subject 22 experienced complete retrograde amnesia following Protocol 7. Memory loss appears permanent, useful for future applications requiring subject cooperation. Reading those files was like discovering that someone you trusted had been torturing people in your basement for years. I felt sick, angry, and profoundly guilty that I hadn't recognized what was happening sooner. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Dr. Blackwood and 6 of his associates were charged with multiple federal crimes, including conducting illegal human experiments, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The pharmaceutical company that had funded the research was revealed to be connected to several other illegal research programs, and their executives faced additional charges. Janet and I were key witnesses in the prosecution, which meant months of depositions, court appearances, and media interviews. The story became national news, with Pine Valley becoming a symbol of the vulnerability of elderly Americans in institutional care. The residents who had been subjected to the experiments faced a long and difficult recovery process. Some, like Mrs. Hartwell, gradually regained much of their cognitive function as the experimental drugs left their systems. Others, like Mr. Kowalski, suffered permanent damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Chen's case was particularly heartbreaking. The experiments had left her with severe memory problems and increased confusion. She could no longer remember how to make her beautiful origami cranes, and she often didn't recognize the staff members who had cared for her for years. Her daughter, who lived in California and had rarely visited, flew in when she learned about the experiments and was devastated by her mother's condition. "I trusted you," she said to me during one of her visits, tears streaming down her face. "I trusted all of you to take care of her, and instead you let them destroy her mind." I had no defense against her anger. She was right. We had failed to protect her mother and all the other residents who had been victimized. The fact that Janet and I had eventually exposed the truth didn't erase the years of abuse that had occurred under our watch. Pine Valley Nursing Home was permanently shut down 6 months after the investigation began. The state health department revoked their license, and the facility was sold to pay settlements to the victims and their families. Many of the residents were transferred to other nursing homes, though some families chose to bring their loved ones home to care for them personally. Janet and I both left nursing after the trial concluded. The experience had shattered our faith in the medical system and in our own ability to protect vulnerable patients. Janet moved back to Georgia to be closer to her family, and I took a job with a non-profit organization that advocates for elderly rights. Dr. Blackwood was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for what he had done. Instead, he gave a rambling speech about the importance of medical research and the sacrifices necessary for scientific progress. "History will vindicate my work," he said, looking directly at me from the defendant's table. "The compounds we developed will eventually revolutionize treatment for dementia and cognitive decline. The subjects who participated in our research contributed to something greater than themselves." Even then, even after everything that had been revealed, he still referred to the residents as subjects and their abuse as participation. He genuinely believed that his research justified the suffering he had caused, and that terrified me more than anything else about the entire experience. The investigation also revealed how Dr. Blackwood had been able to operate for so long without detection. He had carefully cultivated relationships with local officials, made substantial donations to community organizations, and built a reputation as a caring and innovative physician. He had also specifically targeted nursing homes in rural areas where oversight was limited and families were less likely to visit regularly. Most importantly, he had exploited the trust that families place in medical professionals. When he told relatives that their loved ones were receiving enhanced care or innovative treatments, They believed him because he was a doctor, because he spoke with authority and confidence, and because they wanted to believe that their family members were getting the best possible care. The Pine Valley case led to significant changes in how nursing homes are regulated and monitored. New laws were passed requiring more frequent inspections, stricter oversight of medical research involving elderly subjects, and better protection for whistleblowers who report abuse in healthcare settings. But for me, the most important lesson was about the responsibility we all have to speak up when something doesn't seem right. I had noticed signs of the abuse for months before I finally acted, and during that time, more residents were victimized. My fear of confronting authority, my assumption that someone else would notice and act, and my trust in the system all contributed to the continuation of the abuse. 5 years have passed since Pine Valley was shut down. I still think about the residents every day, especially Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Kowalski, and Mrs. Chen. Mrs. Hartwell passed away 2 years ago, but her cognitive function had largely returned in her final months, and she was able to remember and share her experiences with investigators. Her testimony was crucial in securing Dr. Blackwood's conviction. Mr. Kowalski is still alive, but requires full-time care due to the permanent neurological damage caused by the experiments. His nephew, who had rarely visited him at Pine Valley, now cares for him at home and has become a vocal advocate for nursing home reform. Mrs. Chen's condition stabilized somewhat, though she never fully recovered her previous cognitive abilities. Her daughter moved her to a facility near her home in California, where she receives specialized care for the brain damage caused by the experimental drugs. I've learned that there were other facilities like Pine Valley, other Dr. Blackwood's conducting similar experiments on vulnerable populations. The network we exposed was just one part of a larger system of abuse that exploits people who can't advocate for themselves. That's why I'm telling this story now, not because I want sympathy or forgiveness for my role in what happened, but because I want people to understand how easily this kind of abuse can occur and how important it is to question authority when something doesn't seem right. If you have a loved one in a nursing home or any kind of institutional care, visit them regularly. Ask questions about their treatment. Pay attention to changes in their behavior or cognitive function. Don't assume that medical professionals always have your loved one's best interests at heart. And if you work in healthcare or any field where you're responsible for vulnerable people, remember that your first obligation is to those in your care, not to your employer or your career. If you see something that concerns you, speak up. Document it, report it. Don't assume that someone else will take action. The residents of Pine Valley trusted us to protect them, and we failed them for far too long. But their suffering wasn't meaningless if it prevents similar abuse from happening to others. Their stories deserve to be told, their voices deserve to be heard, and their dignity deserves to be restored. I was a nurse for 18 years at Pine Valley Nursing Home, and I had no idea that the elderly residents were being used for experiments. But ignorance isn't an excuse, and trust isn't a substitute for vigilance. We all have a responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves, and that responsibility doesn't end when we clock out or when it becomes inconvenient or scary. The residents of Pine Valley deserved better from all of us. The least we can do now is make sure their story serves as a warning and a call to action for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. Because somewhere, right now, there might be another Pine Valley, another Dr. Blackwood, and another group of vulnerable people who need someone to notice, someone to care, and someone to act. Don't let it be too late for them, like it was for so many of ours.